All right, everyone. There we go. We're on track. And you guys can see the proper screen. All right, cool. Thank you. Um, it's really good to be here. I really enjoy this. Very honored to do this each month. It's probably a lot more interesting for me than it is for you guys, and more helpful for sure. So today I got to give a disclaimer. The slides are slightly different today. They're kind of retro. I've been doing I was able to start doing like an in-person presentation for a couple weeks, and I got to use the whiteboard and stuff. So this is kind of it's just I liked it. I was like, oh, this is fun. So this is kind of a whiteboard presentation. And yeah, so and I do want to say this. So we're the series has been called A Case for Coming Down, Recovering Soul in the Program of Recovery. And today we're talking about hysteria in the big book and the repression of the feminine. And this is a continuation of about the last five sessions that we've been doing. And they've all really been kind of building up to this, to be honest. I want Jung said that Jung said man will be forced to develop his feminine side, to open his eyes to the psyche and to eros. It is a task he cannot avoid unless he prefers to go trailing after women in a hopelessly boyish fashion. And so that's kind of I think that's kind of the thesis of today, as well as of this whole series. And that brings me to this slide. I just want to build a little bit of context here. So this whole series of talks called The Case for Coming Down stemmed from a moment a few months ago where I was attending a Zoom presentation, and one of our beloved speakers who we all know was presenting, and he was asked a question when he finished, and he was asked really directly about Bill Wilson's infidelity. And he was asked why Alcoholics Anonymous refuses to talk about Bill's infidelity, and why Bill's infidelity has been wiped out of the official AA record, and why, as members of AA, we don't have a good response to that. And can't we see that this sort of tradition, I guess, seems to kind of filter into Alcoholics Anonymous at large? These are fair questions, and I do believe they were asked in sincerity, because of all the people I know in AA, that person should have been able to answer the question, to answer her questions. But the thing that struck me was that he really fumbled. He fumbled the answer. He basically said that Bill's kind of spiritual good outweighs his bad, and that on the hierarchy of who Bill is as a person, his infidelity is low down the list, and we don't need to worry about that. That his infidelity doesn't define him. What defines him is his role as the co-founder of AA. And this really got me thinking, right? Number one, I think because I am like Bill in that regard, especially. I've been a very unfaithful person in my relationships. And I've also been very emotionally disconnected in my life, especially in my marriage, in my current marriage, my past marriage, even in my relationships with my family and my kids. So there's a lot of nuance, I think. But the point here is that this series is something like my attempt to answer that question. For me, infidelity was the centerpiece of my life, even though I'd never wanted to talk about it or look at it or feel it or anything like that. And I'm willing to bet that it was the centerpiece of my wife's life as well, because I know how much it bothered her. Now I can see it. And so here we are, right? We're talking about emotional sobriety. Overall, that's the umbrella through which we're approaching this information. And And it's safe to say that Lois was probably highly affected by Bill's infidelity. And I think it is sad that we don't talk about it. And so this, you know, today we're talking about the feminine and hysteria in the big book. And of course, we've got to lead up to that as we go. But I just wanted to put that out there. This is my critique of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I know people will say, well, you can't criticize a program that saved your life. And actually, I disagree. I think more of us should criticize the program because we love the program and because it saved our lives. And so with that, we're gonna launch right in. Some quick kind of background for those who maybe haven't been here. Really, we started out by talking about spirit and soul as psychological orientations. And David L. Miller says this: it's funny, meaning that it's not funny at all, how men are always seeking to bypass the soul, psyche, in their attempt to get a shortcut to spirit, pneuma. That really, so when I use the word spirit and soul, we're talking about psychological orientations, right? Spirit is that part of us that elevates, that wants to go to the mountaintop, that seeks resolution and forgiveness and unconditional love. It seeks to resolve resentment and to get over it and to let go and let God. And all of those spiritual actions that we take, those are spiritually oriented. Psyche, or soul, on the other hand, is that part of us that's continually pulling down on our spiritual uplift. And so when I use those terms, that's kind of what we're talking about. And these are very fundamental. What I've been trying to paint a picture the last few months about how fundamental these concepts are in the Western psyche. They're so fundamental that we can't even see them. They're part of this sort of metaphysical world that we live in, right? Beyond the physical world. Moving on. The key to understanding emotional sobriety, I've made the case, is to develop a personal value system, to develop the feeling function. And this is a tough kind of hinge point for this argument. The more you can understand the feeling function, the more my whole argument's going to make sense. I write, value is to feeling what ideas are to thinking. In other words, thinking is that part of our brains that tells us what a thing is, right? It's obvious. We all think all the time. Feeling is the part of our brains that tell us how much a thing is worth to us, right? It's feeling. James Hillman said that feeling is the reason of the heart, which the reason of the mind cannot really comprehend, right? And so what we gain through the feeling function is a personal value system. When the feeling function's online, we have a value system. When the feeling function is offline, which it is for most of the West, and that's what I'm talking about today, when the feeling function goes offline, then we don't necessarily have a value system. And what happens when we don't have a value system is that we fall for dogma, we fall for politics, we fall for anybody to tell us what's important because we can't really feel what's important for ourselves. And so the idea then with emotional sobriety is that we learn to access the feeling function and develop a personal value system. But this is tricky because the feeling function is tied to the soul. And the soul, as we'll see, has been essentially repressed and rejected for over 2,000 years. Rumi says this. Rumi said that when you live from the soul, you feel a river flowing within you. And I love this, right? Because the thing we feel in us is the feeling. And once we can tap into soul and we kind of can start to, and this is the case for me, when I started to kind of piece together the difference between spirit and soul and focus on connecting with soul, my feeling function started to sort of evolve, and it's changed my life and it's changed my relationships. Emotional sobriety, the cultivation of the feeling function. Here, Bill Wilson is describing emotional sobriety. This comes out of his famous essay that we've looked at. And here he's actually describing a personal value system. Bill says, how shall our unconscious, from which so many of our fears, compulsions, and phony aspirations still stream, be brought into line with what we actually believe, know, and want? How to convince our dumb, raging, and hidden Mr. Hyde becomes our main task. So Bill senses this sort of, the difficulty of the inner world and the outer world, right? And this sort of this spiritual character that we show the world, and then this interior character, Mr. Hyde. And the interesting thing about Mr. Hyde, and thank God for Bill for having the cojones to say this, right? And there I go being misogynist, but he says that Mr. Hyde resists spiritual tools, right? He resists spiritual tools. And so when we circle back to this question of infidelity, right, which I can talk about my infidelity, or I do feel comfortable talking about Bill's infidelity since I do feel like I understand it. There's spiritual tools do nothing. They do some, but they don't do very much when it comes to us managing those Mr. Hyde compulsions and how to truly connect on a deeply emotional level. And I hope that people can hear this message. Bill realized that many old timers had the same problem that he did, right? He says a lot of us old timers, we've got spirituality down, but we still don't have emotional sobriety. The point is that the time in the program does not amount to emotional sobriety, which is shocking, I think, to people with time. It feels like we have emotional sobriety. But that's the tricky thing about this feeling function. If it's not online, we don't actually even know when we're feeling, what we're feeling, if we're feeling, where we feel, how we should feel, and what feeling even means. It's interesting because Bill himself criticized Alcoholics Anonymous, which I don't think a lot of people realize, but he sees Francis Wicks in 1952, and then he starts critiquing AA on two fronts. One front was the dogma. He says, you guys are, we've solidified the big book as scripture, not good. And then the other thing is that we don't have emotional sobriety. And interestingly, John Wellwood, the guy who coined the phrase emotional sobriety, tells us that that dogma and emotional bypass or spiritual bypass, Wellwood coined the phrase spiritual bypass, not emotional sobriety. He coined the phrase spiritual bypass, and that spiritual bypass always accompanies sort of a dogmatic container. And it makes sense why, right? If I don't have my own personal value system, then I have to hide in the dogma because I need the dogma to tell me who I am and what's important and what I do. This is why the old timers who don't have emotional sobriety are also the most steeped in AA dogma. And it makes perfect sense. Once we kind of unravel this, it all starts to click. Another thing is this: emotional sobriety does not equal emotional maturity. The reason is because emotional maturity does not equal a personal value system. These behavioral approaches that we try to use to cultivate emotional sobriety doesn't actually work. And the reason is because it doesn't get far enough down in the psyche. All right. Let's see here. The Zoom screen's a little weird. It's always in the way for me. So last session, we talked about the polytheistic psyche. God is dead, but not the gods, says James Hillman. And Jung said that the gods have returned as diseases. So we have many daimones, many logics, many feelings sort of swirling around inside of us. I think Wilson was aware of this. One of his was clearly Mr. Hyde. Each feeling then becomes its own God. It has its own claim upon us, right? If God is an autonomous psychic complex, then we have many gods within us. I like that Jung said that God is the name by which I designate all things which upset my subjective views, plans, and intentions, right? So every time something kind of cascades inside of me and it makes me feel like I'm out of control, that would be, in terms of a polytheistic approach, that would be one of the gods. And in this way, polytheism creates a model through which we can live a more meaningful emotional life. Because rather than sort of trying to avoid our emotions or to bypass over them or to say, okay, I feel uncomfortable right now, but if I just feel this feeling, then I won't have to feel uncomfortable later. Or we say, oh, I need to work on this, right? This feeling has come up, and if I work on it, I'm going to be a better person. These are not actually polytheistic approaches. They're actually monotheistic because they're fixed on this sort of linear progression. And the tendency there is to always move away from the psyche, from soul. Even Wilson's statement, God is everything. We talked about this last time. God is either everything or he is nothing. What is our choice to be? That's a fundamentally monotheistic setup, right? So in the 12 steps, we think we're clever because we get to choose our own conception of God, but we just automatically revert back to monotheism because it is so deeply programmed within us. And we're going to talk more about that as we go today. Marion Woodman says this: addiction is not a love affair with the substance itself, but a rejection of the feminine. By rejecting the feminine, the addict rejects life as it is. And so the feminine is the soul, right? Spirit is masculine, soul is feminine. What does it mean to reject the feminine? And what does it have to do with monotheism? These are these two kind of grand metaphysics that we live under. To reject the feminine is to reject the feminine component in us that really just wants us to feel. I think that might be oversimplistic, but I do believe that fundamentally the feminine is our ability to access the feeling function and to feel our emotions, to feel our moods, to pay attention to our dreams, to sort of live in that, to live within the reason of the heart. There's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Bill was abandoned as a child by his mother and his father. That was clearly a difficult, traumatic experience for him. It makes sense that when he gets sober, he needs to bypass, right? Just like all of us. I'm not necessarily making the case that spiritual bypass is bad. Spiritual bypass is good because it works. The case I'm making is that if we only use spiritual bypass, we're going to get ourselves into some trouble. And so, and the point of these lessons or these talks or whatever they are, is that if people get to the point where where they get to the point where, say, Bill Wilson was, where I was, where many of us get to, where these spiritual principles just really aren't doing it anymore, rather than sort of dig into the dogma more for this sense of safety, right? It's like, oh, but if this doesn't work, what's left, right? We're so afraid to criticize Alcoholics Anonymous because we think it's the last house on the block. I'm not saying it's not. What I'm saying though is that we could deepen our experience in AA if we get to that point where Bill was. If spiritual tools aren't working, what's going to work? Bill was brave enough to ask the question, and I think it's great. In the big book, Bill says that we avoid the deliberate manufacture of misery, and I've been thinking a lot about that lately, because and the question is this: if I can deliberately manufacture misery, then on the same token, I can also manufacture serenity. And so then the question I have to ask myself is, how do I know that the serenity I'm feeling isn't just a spiritual bypass? How do I know I haven't deliberately manufactured this serenity so as I can avoid my misery? To avoid misery is spiritual bypass. Woodman describes this as a rejection of the feminine. We're going to circle back to Woodman later on. About that addiction itself is an attempt to avoid these deeper feelings. So Socrates and the repression of the feminine. Last time we talked about eusebia. It's the Greek practice of living in fidelity or right reverence to the gods. And the gods were gods of feeling. Ares, Aphrodite, Eros, Artemis. These are all sort of most of them are feeling gods. Some of them are nature gods, but they all have something to do with feeling. And to live amongst the gods and to live in right reverence to the gods was to practice communing with them and figuring out what it was they were trying to say. Socrates was he was convicted of apatheia, which was impiety or irreverence towards the gods, and this was an offense. And then he was preaching, his new doctrine to the youth, and they convicted him and killed him. And I told the story last time. Xantippe comes in, his wife, he's about to die. He's postulating about the eternal nature of the soul, and he's perfectly calm. And she comes in and she's hysterical and she's sad and she's crying. And she says, "Oh, Socrates, this is the last time we'll ever see you." And he says, "Guards, get her out of here. She's disturbing my serenity." And what's invented in that moment, that is the creation myth of the modern West, in my opinion. What's created in that moment is this idea of apatheia. Apatheia comes from the Greek apathos. It means without passion. It's without passion, suffering, or feeling. And it means freedom from disturbance. Incidentally, serenity also means freedom from disturbance. Serenity used to be a word that was used to describe the climate, right? If it was a serene day, there was not a cloud on the horizon. Now we use it as more of a description of the internal. So, but to be without pathos or without passion means to be without sympathy, without pathology. It means to be without suffering and without emotion. And so in a big way, like this, so as a person who has been extremely emotionally disconnected in the past, when I actually read this, I was really blown away, because apatheia means without sympathy, without passion, without compassion, without feeling. That would describe me to a T before I was able to start doing some of this soul work and to kind of develop a feeling function. I just couldn't connect with my wife, especially. She's just the best example I have. But I would even see other people connecting and perhaps being intimate and stuff, and I just always felt like, man, what's wrong with me? Why can't I access that? Why can't I feel that? What's going on? And it's funny, because just like with physical sobriety, with emotional sobriety, we don't attack it head on, right? We don't attack the drinking problem to get sober physically. We do this a roundabout thing with spirituality. The same thing happens with soul work and with emotional sobriety. We develop the feeling function, but we don't do it by feeling our feelings. That's one way to do it. But there's a lot of other things that have to happen. We have to sort of adopt this eusebia, right? This kind of reverence for those feelings. Real quick, there's in the ancient Greek world, there was this kind of tripartite kind of anthropology, right? The human beings were composed of these three elements. In the middle, there was soma, the body. And then we have psyche, which is, the word psyche means breath. We also have psyche in pneuma. Pneuma also means breath. So the interesting thing is that for psyche means the breath of the individual, right? So psyche is multiplicitous. We're all taking breaths. And when we take those breaths, that part of pneuma, or the atmosphere, is separate, right? It's like it becomes individual, right? So it's very individualistic, particular. Yeah. Pneuma, on the other hand, is breath in terms of like atmosphere, of wind, of spirit. Okay. And then what happens in the Greek world is that soma, and when I describe the Greek world, I might as well be describing, emotional sobriety. It's that the body then becomes sort of the bridge between pneuma and psyche, right? And so there's access to pneuma and to spirituality and to serenity and to the beautiful visions of the universe, right? But there's also access to psyche, right? And to the feeling function, and to depression, and to anger and grief and sadness, all those things that pneuma hates. And then we have soma, the body, being right there in the middle, just the thing that experiences this spirit and this soul. when the body holds the soul and the spirit together, then feeling can flow, right? And that feeling is really the key, the feeling function, how to generate value, a value system. Now, it makes sense that Socrates's movement gained so much momentum. So he basically pitches this idea of like being without pathos, right? And he drinks the hemlock and he dies and he doesn't show any emotion while he's doing it. And what he does is he starts a whole philosophical movement that we're going to trace right now. But it makes sense that it was so intoxicating, right? Because essentially what Socrates was promising was liberation from grief, longing, depression, heaviness about being human, the passions, right? Who doesn't want to have freedom from all of the garbage that comes along with just being a human being? It makes perfect sense that we want to do everything we can to bypass that, right? Spirit, Latin spiritus, breath, wind, from spirare, to breathe. Later, the animating principle, then strong distilled liquor. So alcohol comes from the Arabic alcool, means powdered coal. They used it for I think it was eyeliner. And alcohol came to mean the subtle essence, and then the volatile spirit of wine. And both words converge in this idea of volatile essence, of vapor, of intoxication, of floating away, and of sort of bypassing the ground, right? So, and what happens then is Socrates sets this kind of train in motion, and then Plato picks it up. So Plato was Socrates's pupil. And Plato begins to sort of systematize Socrates's ideas. And he did it with a lot of allegories. And one of his famous allegories is the allegory of the cave. So there's a bunch of people, they're stuck in a cave their whole life, they're chained, they're looking forward, they can't turn their head or anything, and it's really dark, there's a fire burning behind them, and there's people would bring puppets, and the puppets would be cast on the wall in front of these people in chains. And so they would see these images, and that was the only thing they knew. It was that for them, that was reality, because they'd never been outside of the cave. And then one of the prisoners is released, and he's slowly able to kind of get up and look around, and he sees the fire, and he's tripping out, and then he walks out the cave, and he comes into the light, and his eyes adjust, and he finally starts to see like the real forms of the figures that they were projecting onto the walls. And then finally he sees the sun, the form of the good, like so what basically what Plato invents here is this idea of awakening, okay, which doesn't really exist before. This concept of enlightenment, right, of spiritual awakening, of walking from the darkness into the light. So Plato did not preach monotheism in the religious sense. He framed its philosophical groundwork by positing the one above the many, a singular good that reoriented the psyche's diversity towards spirit's unifying clarity. And so this pneumatic kind of pull, this spiritual pull, is really, really strong. And Plato begins to sort of implement it as like a way of life, a metaphysic. He's, and it really takes hold. He sets up an academy. Next, we have Aristotle. So Plato teaches Aristotle, who is also a philosopher. Plato talked about forms. Aristotle comes in and talks about movement. And incidentally, so Aristotle kind of mythologizes this whole system. What's being created here, you guys? I mean, keep in mind, we go from archaic Greece, which is just pure Eusebia. Then we have Socrates, this whole brand new idea, and then it sets in motion this train of thought that basically leads all the way up to the modern times. So Aristotle was also a philosopher. He taught Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great took this philosophy on the road and basically went out and conquered the entire Western world, all the way into the Near East. Interestingly, Alexander the Great, when he took over a community, he would sacrifice to their gods, and doing that he would win favor. but he didn't necessarily believe in their gods, right? He believed in Plato's God, this sort of this one, right? The form of the good. So in other words, Aristotle and Alexander the Great, they're practicing this idea that we practice, right? God as we understood him. They knew that, and this is Aristotle says, a tyrant must put on the appearance of uncommon devotion to religion. Subjects are less apprehensive of illegal treatment from a ruler whom they consider God-fearing and pious. They believe him to have the gods on his side. And so, Alexander the Great had no problem sacrificing to the other gods because he knew they were all a symbol of the one God, right? This one sort of monotheistic idea that begins to get implemented. Next, we jump up to Stoicism in the 3rd century before Christ, before the Common Era. And by this time, this philosophy becomes a daily practice. It's almost like a therapy, right? So the Stoics are the first people to really implement a daily spiritual kind of disciplined action. So they journal, they meditate, they exercise, they have certain kind of, it's a program. The Stoics basically introduce a philosophical / spiritual program. And this is one of the things they did. When you are offended at any man's fault, turn to yourself and study your own failings. Then you will forget your anger. It's interesting that a couple of 100 years after Socrates, we get to this point with the Stoics that they no longer see, because the Greeks weren't necessarily practicing eusebia. It just was the way it was the way things were. Feeling and thinking were sort of equal. They just kind of lived in this fluid, dynamic world with feelings and earthquakes and everything else. But by the time we get to the Stoics, they have to practice because they already feel disconnected enough, and there's enough angst that it's this thing. And they actually implement the idea of apatheia. It becomes for them law. So they sort of exalt serenity as the goal, and that to not practice apatheia was then to essentially miss the mark, to be sinful, right? And so it's becoming like more and more entrenched. And so feeling is long gone here, right? The Stoics actually don't even practice in order to develop feeling. They still want to move away from feeling, and they're moving fully into this idea of serenity as king, right? And so, yeah, the world has drastically changed at this point. Next, we're just going to jump right up to Paul. Paul was essentially the man who invented Christianity. He was a Greek. He lived in, he was kind of roaming around, Europe and the Middle East and stuff. And he had a spiritual awakening. He was a Jew, and he was persecuting the Christians. And he was, he would condemn them to death and stuff, and probably participated in their death. And one day he was on the way to another trial in Damascus. His name was Saul. And en route, he had a vision. He kind of falls down, and he sees a bright light, and he hears a voice, and he says, "Who are you? Who are you?" And the voice says, "I am Jesus Christ, the one you've been persecuting." And Paul has a spiritual awakening, right? A white light experience. And at that point, he becomes sort of this mouthpiece for the small groups of Christians that were scattered around the area. And there was a small group in each of these cities, and Paul would write letters, and he was steeped in Greek philosophy. So he knew all about the soul and the psyche, and pneuma, right? Psyche and pneuma. And as he's writing his letters to these different churches, what's being established is this new Christian doctrine, right? And this was the church doesn't really exist at this point, but it's a little bit, it does, but it's like really scattered, almost like very early Alcoholics Anonymous. This is one of the scriptures that is referenced. He says, the natural man, which is in Greek, is psychikos anthropos, meaning the man of the psyche, does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, but the spiritual man pneumatikos anthropos, right? Pneuma judges all things. And so Paul sharpens the psychic split. And really more and more is, we're still talking about the repression of the feminine here. So, and basically what he's saying, those who live from psyche are natural, defective, and unworthy of the truth, while those who live from pneuma or the spirit are exalted and superior. And this is the language of the repression of the feminine that essentially kind of really starts to take root, obviously, because the Christian church becomes so powerful. And Paul had a huge role in shaping that theology. This is from David L. Miller. And this is a really interesting point. He says the word psyche occurs only 57 times in the New Testament. Pneuma, on the other hand, 274 times. Over half the psyche references appear in the Gospels and Acts, which Paul didn't write. Only 4 appear in Paul's letters. Paul regularly casts psychikoi as bad and the pneumatikoi as good. And so right here we see the really kind of this split between soul and spirit is like really getting entrenched now. I mean, they didn't know how much it was going to get entrenched back then because they probably had no idea how big Christianity was going to become. I mean, it became massive. The imbalance between soul and psyche and pneuma shows the shift that we've been tracing. So we start with early Greece. Psyche and pneuma are kind of the same, the center of human life, this animating presence, the seat of feeling. But by the time we get into Christianity in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries, soul is barely hanging on by a thread and spirit has become huge, right? And so the whole culture is like moving toward this pneumatic sort of spiritual bypass. So what begins with Socrates and Plato's silencing Xantippe, climbing out of the cave toward the one, begins to be hardened into a metaphysical hierarchy that exalts the spiritual, the masculine, the logos, the thinking, while feeling and the feminine and the body are repressed. So this begins to tell us why it is that in Christian literature, typically, there is no reference to the divine feminine. The Godhead is a boys' club, and this is why. It's because of this huge leaning into spirit, right? And automatically when we lean into the spirit, there's a repression of the feminine that just happens automatically. The symbols tell us that this is what happens. It's almost like, I mean, your dreams will show you that this is happening. It's kind of hard to argue that this actually isn't the case. At least for me, this explains everything for me. That's why I'm so excited about it. Oh, there was a falling star. The narrowing of soul in the councils of the church. So I'm going to do some reading right here because these are so important and so interesting. So 325, Nicaea 1. The first council of Nicaea was called by Emperor Constantine to settle the Arian controversy. Arius had taught that Christ, the Son, was created and therefore subordinate to the Father. So he was actually a separate substance. And his opponent was named Athanasius, who insisted that the Son was eternal and fully divine. And so the council had to get together and take a vote on this, and they sided with Athanasius simply because, and this was the Nicene Creed, and this declared that Christ and the Father were of one substance. So this decision right here, if we're looking at this in terms of our movement away from soul and multiplicity, this decision crowns unity over plurality. It's Platonic. It's this old Platonic idea, the form of the good, the one thing, the Son. At this point, many schools and many different interpretations of Christian ideas are silenced. Diversity of thought becomes heresy. Interestingly, the word heresy used to mean choice. From here on, to choose was not just agreement, but it was impiety. It was asabia. In psychological terms, the plurality of the gods and the daimones was collapsed now into one spirit. And interestingly, in the year 380, Christianity becomes the state religion. And then by the 5th century, they're starting to impose the death penalty for heresy. So that doesn't, we're not quite there yet, but we're close. In 553, we have Constantinople, which Constantinople won, sorry, I should say. The second council was at Constantinople under Justinian, where they condemned the teachings of Origen, who had speculated that souls existed before birth, falling into bodies as a result of some primordial error. He also held out the possibility of universal salvation, called sorry, I can't pronounce that. The council rejected all of this, declaring that the soul was created at the same time as the body and had no pre-existence. So what's happening in this second council is that the soul then is cut off from essentially its mythic depth and its eternal background. The psyche is no longer part of this essentially ancient divine drama, right? It becomes bound to this really kind of short linear history, a single birth, one life, one judgment, one heaven, one hell, one shot, right? And it's this very sort of syncopated thing. Like it's not this eternal cyclical thing anymore. It's like this one little piece. And this becomes a big deal because at this point, the soul is cut off from its depths, right? The dreams no longer have deeper kind of ancient historic meaning, and everything sort of collapsed into this moment. In Nicaea 2, this was the famous iconoclastic controversy that divided the church. And it had been happening for centuries or for decades, and the question was whether images were sacred or idolatrous. And some people saw their art, their figurines, their everything, right? They saw it as kind of as having a numinous presence. It became these figures and these images were portals into the divine. At Nicaea, the church basically said, okay, we can have images, but there's a limitation. The images are no longer to be treated as presences themselves of the divine. Instead, they are mere allegories or teaching tools. And so in this moment, the imaginal, the psyche, is stripped of its numinosity. Images no longer can be experienced as carriers of presence. They become mere allegories, pointing beyond themselves, pointing to the scriptures, pointing to some historical undertaking, right? And what happens here is that the soul is kind of erased from the world. The anima mundi is gone now. The world soul, right? The soul's not to be found anywhere. And this decisive wound to the imaginal basis of the psyche, it really does damage to the feeling function. And I'm getting all this stuff from James Hillman. And there's one more council that's really important as well. This is the Fourth Council of Constantinople. This delivers the final blow to the soul, to psyche. Here they declared that human beings are made up of body and spirit only. So the tripartite anthropology that we saw earlier of body, soul, and spirit that was central to Greek thought and early Christian theology is now collapsed. The soul is erased from the official constitution of human nature. And so this is why now, today, when we talk about the soul as being separate from the spirit, it is just so foreign and so odd for us to hear. This was the final victory of spirit over soul, with no mediating realm between flesh and spirit. The feeling-filled domain of psyche was eliminated. Hillman said that the soul only deals in value. And so when the soul is cut off, value vanishes. The personal value system vanishes. And that's the world we live in today. After this, soul and spirit became interchangeable in popular usage. The word spirit and the word soul essentially become the same thing. And the distinction was, the earlier distinction is forgotten. And this is what I want to read here. Since then, since the Second Council of Constantinople, or in 869, the fourth, the words spirit and soul have been interchangeable in popular usage. Today, when people speak of soul, they usually mean spirit, having lost all sense of their distinction. So this then really kind of paints a picture. I'm trying to paint a picture. I mean, just to circle back, if the goal is emotional sobriety, right? But it's not so easy as just saying, oh, I'm just going to start to feel my feelings and I'm going to behave when I'm in traffic. That's not emotional sobriety. The problem is that the layer where emotional sobriety actually exists in the human psyche is way down past all of this metaphysics that we've inherited, right? It takes a lot of work to get down into that stuff. We really have to kind of go back in history with the way we believe and see the world. So this brings us now to step 3. We made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. The question of why do we go through all this information? Why do we talk about these ancient church councils, all this stuff? It's because we've inherited the metaphysics unconsciously. These are not dusty theological disputes, but they are literally the architecture of the modern psyche, of modern Western psychology. When we put serenity as the goal, right? And trust me, serenity is our goal. We pray for it in every single meeting. When forgiveness becomes more important than resentment, when the whole point is to transcend our feelings, we're basically repeating the decisions of the church councils. So when we mistrust resentment, grief, passion, we are echoing the suspicion of feeling and we are rejecting the feminine. When we imagine our feeling life or our instincts are defects of character, we are falling into this way of thinking, the way that was established at these church councils. This is why emotional sobriety is such a radical proposition, which is the point I've been trying to make this whole time. It requires more than we manage our emotions. It means that we have to recover what was exiled. We have to recover the archaic sense that of the soul, right? That eusebic sort of approach to life where the gods are speaking in and through us, through our feelings, our moods, grief, passion, the body. To restore feeling is to restore the pantheon of the ancient gods. And look, we could use the Greek pantheon or we can use any other culture. We can make up our own gods, right? As long as we try to be polytheistic about it. This is how we dignify the feminine within. And how we undo centuries of repression, right? That were eventually ratified by the church. It didn't start with the church. The church was simply picking up on a system that had been established, in ancient Greece. I want to say this. When we say that we made a decision to turn our will and lives over to the care of God as we understood him, that is not a neutral statement, right? It's loaded with millennia of prosecution, of misogyny, of repression of the feminine, of repression of feeling. And emotional sobriety requires that we are able to step out of that container. So let's talk about misogyny. On the surface, misogyny means hatred of women. And I'm not suggesting here that we hate women. Maybe some people in the audience hate women. Maybe you only hate women sometimes or whatever. I don't know. But that's not the point, right? For me, my misogyny really kind of, in my life, it really gets to the way I mistrust my own interior being, right? That I mistrust feeling, that I mistrust moods, that I'm always trying to bypass uncomfortable emotions. That's how misogyny manifests for me. That I really hope that the men in the Zoom can pay attention here, right? I've found that beneath my prejudices, right? And if I cringe at the word misogyny, right? Or if I cringe at the word like feminism or something like that, like there's probably something in there for me to look at. And because the greatest truths, the greatest, like the breakthroughs for me are always sitting just beneath my prejudice, just beneath the part of me that gets prickly, right? Um, Misogyny. So, and I started with this quote, and I'm going to read it now so we can all read it together. It says, this is Jung. He says, man will be forced to develop his feminine side, to open his eyes to the psyche and to eros. It is a task he cannot avoid unless he prefers to go trailing after women in a hopelessly boyish fashion. So misogyny isn't social prejudice or personal hatred. It is literally the psychic structure we have inherited by being either born or raised in Western culture. At its core, misogyny is hatred of the feminine within. The hatred, the mistrust of grief, vulnerability, eros, embodiment, the feeling function itself. When the spirit represses these inner dimensions, they don't vanish, right? We project them outward. And this is where we get into kind of this stuff about hysteria in the big book. We basically project our internal state onto women, right? Women become the symbolic carriers of disorder, temptation, and hysteria. And so misogyny is more than a cultural problem, right? Which is kind of crazy to say, but it's actually a metaphysical problem. That I would say that it's deeper than culture, it's metaphysical. Because it grows out of these psychological or philosophical structures that I've been tracing. Beginning with Socrates silencing Xantippe, there's evidence of it before that for sure. But with Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Alexander the Great, it really becomes a culture-wide movement that just essentially is going to take over the entire system. I want to read this. This comes from St. Augustine. He says, woman is directly tied to the fall and to death, guilt, and sin. She was merely man's helpmate, a function which pertains to her alone. She is not the image of God. So he was a big player in establishing Christian doctrine. And, it's funny, like Augustine, if I remember correctly, he himself had a problem with women before he had a spiritual awakening. He read Paul one day. I can't remember which scripture he read, but he read some Paul and was like, oh my God, it's true. His mother was a Christian and she was always trying to convert him. But yeah, but it makes sense. So he comes in and he adopts a spiritual way of life that basically requires him to reject the feminine, right? And that's the whole point of this spirit versus soul discussion. The more we move towards spirit, automatically, the more we are rejecting soul. That means that we're moving toward thinking, away from feeling, that we're moving toward what is masculine in the psyche and away from what is feminine. There's a great quote in the Bible, and I think it's in Genesis chapter 3. It says, Adam, God finds out that they've eaten the fruit and they're in big trouble. They're covering themselves with branches and leaves. And God says, who told you you were naked? And Adam says, the woman you gave me, she gave me the fruit and that's why I ate it, right? So just automatically like blames the woman for it. And that's like at the core of this myth, this Western myth, right? That we've adopted. So we talk about the word hysteria. Plato Plato says this, he says, the womb is the cause of all these complaints. It is an animal within an animal, desirous of procreation. And so it makes sense why Socrates was treating Xantippe this way, right? His wife, right? She was the problem. If we look at the etymology of the word hysteria, it comes from the Greek hystera, which means womb or uterus. It's related to hysterikos, which is suffering in the womb. And the idea is that women's emotional and physical disturbances were caused by a wandering or restless womb. Plato essentially says that unless the womb is put to its proper use, then it causes all manner of psychoses and disease. Hippocrates, who was a contemporary of Plato, the father of medicine, also spoke of the wandering womb and talked about hysteria. And sadly, this conception of hysteria and of women essentially doesn't change from the time of Hippocrates all the way up through all 2000 years up into the 19th century. So we kind of jump way forward now, understanding all of this metaphysics that's kind of circling in the background. So Jean-Martin Charcot, who died in 1893, was a Frenchman, the father of modern neurology. And he's at a hospital in Paris, and he begins to study hysteria. And he would get women who were having hysterical, come aparts or whatever, and he would have other doctors like come and look, and they would sort of monitor these women. So he kind of made a spectacle out of it. Freud studied under Charcot, and he was influenced pretty deeply by Charcot's ideas that hysteria was an actual disorder, like that there was something really going on within, like it wasn't like a big show. Freud discovered the unconscious. We kind of credit him with that. And he did so largely through his work with hysterical women in the 1880s and 1890s. He began treating women whose symptoms of paralysis, convulsion, fainting, and loss of speech didn't have an organic cause. And what he would do is he would sit down with these women, and this is where he imposed what is known as the talking cure, right? He would help them recall repressed memories, and he would use their dreams and stuff, and he would get them to talk about that stuff that was kind of inside. And he found that it helped them, right? And so he was kind of able to develop like talk therapy. This led to the idea that these hysterical symptoms were symbolic expressions of unconscious conflicts, typically like traumatic or forbidden desires. So a lot of sexual repression and stuff that Freud was looking at, and he was kind of able to help them sort of get well, right? And kind of reshape their thinking with this therapy. So obviously, then Jung studies under Freud. And Freud uncovers the unconscious through hysterical women. And I want to say something about that there's this millennia long repression of the feminine, repression of the psyche, movement into spirit, the exaltation of masculinity, right? In eternity, you know what I mean? And yet the unconscious is continually sort of working in the background. The psyche is always going, and then out of like a miracle, right? These women who are experiencing hysteria, through that, like the unconscious is discovered, right? And then the psyche. And this was kind of Jung's thing. Jung discovers the psyche, the soul. He rediscovers the soul that had been lost in those church councils. And he takes a different path. Jung kind of experienced the soul in his own life, in his own dreams, the Red Book, his own sort of his own struggles, right? And so where Freud sees pathology, right, and sort of this thing that needs to be decoded in hysteria, Jung sees the psyche, right? That the psyche is kind of dramatizing itself through symptoms like hysteria, dreams, depression, etc. So Jung says the symptom is not a morbid growth, but a meaningful phenomenon, right? So, and so this is big because Jung rediscovers the soul. And so he kind of returns to the older Greek sense, the soul, the spirit, and the body. And then Hillman comes along, and he says our complexities are history at work in the soul. And so he sort of adds to what Jung gives us. And him and a few colleagues begin to really kind of separate this history of like the spirit and the soul and why these matter. So, and then what I'm using then is I'm sort of taking their framework for this kind of metaphysical setup or whatever, and I'm looking at how does this relate to emotional sobriety, right? And to feeling. And I think that this is how. emotion, and this is why I say emotional sobriety runs deeper than emotional maturity or just managing our emotions, right? We've got to get a lot deeper in order to really experience it. So we go to Hysteria in the Big Book, and we go back to Bill's infidelity. So, and Bill was known to be unfaithful, right? And sometimes he was a little more honest about it than others. There's an interesting section in Bill's story where he says that he was saved from infidelity often because he was too drunk, right? So, you know, he was like too drunk to be able to get it on, and so therefore he didn't cheat, and just stuff like that. In step 4, Bill is talking about the sex inventory, and he's talking about what men should do. So I mean, it's important to note that when Bill wrote the Big Book, he was writing it to men. I mean, there was possibly one sober woman, but the culture back then was a man's culture. Alcoholism was a men's disease. So Bill's writing to men, and he says, speaking of infidelity, right? The men are sitting around the table and they're talking about their own infidelity. And he says, we avoid hysterical thinking or advice. So in other words, the point is like, don't get too carried away. But here's the thing about this idea of hysteria. In the 20th century, the cultural inheritance that we've been tracing, especially around hysteria specifically, was still in the air. It was still thought of as a woman's illness, a disorder of nerves, emotion, and instability bound to the feminine body. So when Bill warns against hysterical advice, he's painting women as unstable, overly emotional, or obstructive even to a man's sobriety. So his language is repeating, we say Bill was just a man of his time, and that's true. He's essentially repeating this age-old, metaphysical script from Plato to Charcot to Freud, that the feminine is equated with disorder. Feeling is defective, right? And that the masculine spirit enthroned is the solution to all things. So Bill's warning to avoid hysterical advice is more of a warning against getting advice from a woman on how to deal with this, with one's own infidelity. And this is sort of the misogyny that I'm talking about. It's repression of the feminine, right? But it's cloaked in a spiritual idealism, a spiritual principle. But it's really just it's the old Socratic story of rejecting the feminine and saying, get out of here, you're disturbing my peace. Bill, and I want to say this because I'm really speaking of personal experience, right? Bill's betrayals of Lois really fundamentally are betrayal of the feminine itself. There's this cultural wound of the repression of the feminine is really just repeating in Alcoholics Anonymous. So I think this is the answer, right, to the question, why don't we talk about this in AA? Why can't we get real about this? Why are we perpetuating this tradition of our men being cheaters in Alcoholics Anonymous, which is true in many circles? And I wonder if this isn't why, right? It's because the conversation has to go so deep to really have meaning. The answers just lie. They lie so deep in the woods here, right? It's literally taken us like 8 hours to get to this point. To the wives, Bill's anima projection and his betrayal of Lois. Bill's most egregious betrayal of Lois, in my opinion, and his betrayal of the program was that he didn't let Lois write this chapter. Instead, he impersonates a woman. And in his impersonation, he says, we have been hysterical. Bill knew that a woman needed to say it, right? But he didn't know a woman whom he trusted enough to let say it herself. And this is the essence of misogyny. It's an inability to connect emotionally. It's an inability to take the risk of letting the woman speak, right? And then listening to what she has to say and engaging with what she has to say. I know for me, like I did a lot of emotional damage in my relationship through my own infidelity. And one of the key sort of repair things that I can do is to just be able to talk about it, right? It's not even that there was new information that came out or anything like that. But the really damaging thing was in my relationship, as far as I can understand it, was that I was unable and unwilling to talk about it. And the reason is because I just simply didn't know how. Not only am I rejecting the feminine out here, but I'm also rejecting the internal feminine. I don't know what to do with my own hysteria. And the irony with Bill's statement here, we have been hysterical, speaking as a woman, was that I would almost bet my life savings on the fact that if you could have been in that kitchen in Brooklyn, Bill would have been the one acting hysterically, most likely. And if not, if Lois was indeed hysterical, most likely she deserved to be hysterical and Bill deserved everything he had coming. And that's just the nature of the relationships that we have between men and women, right? And I see this everywhere now. I see it in my own relationship. Very often, when I see my wife as being very upset, I'm the one that's like freaking out, right? And I'm literally just projecting it onto her. And I think that the tricky part of all this is that I wanted to so let me read this. Dr. Esther Fisher Homburger says, where hysteria is diagnosed, misogyny is not far away. Where hysteria is projected, spiritual bypass is fully underway, right? When I see a hysterical woman, I'm the one that's being a toxic man. And I don't find many variations of that formula. The way I had this kind of, the way I always approached fighting and stuff before I started doing this heavy lifting emotionally was the old spiritual axiom, right? If I'm upset, something's wrong with me. If I'm upset, something must be wrong with me. If that's an axiom, then it goes the other way as well. If you're upset, something is wrong with you. And this was the way I approached all of our fights and all of our misunderstandings in our marriage. I was always convinced deep down that if she were working a spiritual program the way I was, then we wouldn't have these problems. And it took a lot of work for me to be able to see out of that kind of that pneumatic haze that I had kind of built up around myself. Lois, I want to say this. Lois Wilson did more for Alcoholics Anonymous than practically anybody, because she did the emotional labor in her relationship with Bill Wilson. The program that Bill Wilson created was not equipped to handle Bill Wilson's emotional body. For that, he had to go to his wife. And she bore that burden for all of us. And I think that, so this is my criticism of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's that not that if we have to be very careful, because we end up inheriting this. Hillman said somewhere that the psychology of our founders tends to filter into the psychology of those people who sort of adore and admire them, right? It filters down. And Bill's psychology in this regard has filtered into Alcoholics Anonymous. This is why even he could say, we have a problem with emotional sobriety. So this is my criticism, right? And it's, and I guess it's an invitation. that we kind of start doing, especially as men, you know, that we get into these feelings, we get into the feeling function, we do the emotional labor in our own lives. We stop projecting hysteria or just even discomfort or emotional instability. And that we recognize the great burden that we're putting on the people in our lives. There's one more quote I want to read from Marion Woodman. She says, an addiction is anything we do to avoid hearing the messages of body and soul. And that's the repression of the feminine. Addiction, this is a radical kind of revision of the idea of addiction, right? That our addictions are all of our attempts to avoid feeling. And I wonder if that's not why there's over 400 sister fellowships, 12-step fellowships, right? It's like, I feel like that's evidence that we're all searching for something more. Like there's got to be something else. Like we sort of reach the end of our spiritual kind of the spiritual path sort of dies off, and we're left facing the next frontier, the sort of forest, and we all want more. And so we go start a new meeting or we go start a new fellowship, right? But until we can really get behind all that stuff and get into these metaphysics, I don't think that there's much hope for us for things really changing. To wrap it up, Hillman says, the end of misogyny marks the end of the need for psychotherapy. I would say this: the moment we stop distrusting the feminine, both within and without, is the moment we stop needing to spiritually bypass. And yeah, so with that, I will go ahead and turn it back over. And thank you, everyone.